Prime Minister. Go for it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for calling me up here. Most august panel, most august house, everyone who has been so supportive, everyone who just helped me prep, my fantastic team, my fantastic partner for a great career, fantastic sign-off. I'm real happy with everyone right now. We're going to go ahead and talk about the case that I want to bring forward. And actually, no, before I do that, I just want to point something out. These guys are so nice. This is our 7th Gov, and they came up and offered to go. Way to be, guys. Way to be great debaters. But that's not important. Because now we're going to talk about the round, because we like where we're going to go. What we're going to do, as we did in the last round, is put you in a situation in which you probably have encountered many times. We're not going to make you the ruler of some foreign land. We're going to make you yourself, or a general, human, individual person. You're walking down the street in a major metropolis, and you see a homeless man. This homeless man looks like a very typical homeless man. He's got a lot of coats bunched up around him. You can mostly just see his face. He's sitting, looking at the ground, looking really upset. He has a sign in front of him that says, "Homeless, hungry, please help." You have about $1 worth of change in your pocket. We're going to ask side opposition. Would you all like to take that $1 worth of change and drop it in his cup, or do you want to keep it for yourself?
One question.
Sure.
Is there any way you could sort of ask the homeless person something about their situation first? You just have to decide, knowing nothing else.
We really want to make this the kind of decision that you actually make every day. So like you're on the way to work, you're not going to stop and take him for a sandwich, you're not going to stop and interrogate him, you're walking to the subway and have $1, you can pitch it or you cannot.
We're going to say don't give him the
Yes, we're not just love to be humanitarian. So we're going to tell you how happy we are. We get to defend helping another person because it's fantastic. The first thing that I want to tell you about is increasing the relative effectiveness of the money. And this is really important because realize that this money means much more to him than it does to you. You have less than $1. What are you going to do with it? At Brandeis, you can't even buy a soda with it. This is really insignificant to you, but to him it could mean a whole lot more. First of all, he knows exactly what he wants. He has much more agency over spending this money, over deciding what thing is going to be best for him that day than you could possibly do by making any kind of decisions for him. What do you think?
Okay, but if you want to be a nice guy with the money, the person that can make the most use of it is some guy in Africa who for like 5 cents.
Imagine being, but in this instance, right now, you can drop the money or you cannot. We're telling you there's really very few reasons not to drop the money because it's so important to help another individual, but don't let me get ahead of myself. Now I'm talking to you about relative utility, and that's really important because realize that once you donate the money, the relative utility in this situation skyrockets. He has much more utility because he had no money and now he has about $1. Maybe that means we can eat some food that day. Maybe that means he has enough energy to go out and look for a job. We're just thinking of all the wonderful ways in which he could use this money. But realize that your utility increases too. Essentially, you're paying for that feeling that you get when you can give someone else something that helps them. And we think that's a really worthwhile thing, especially when $100. Realize that he gets a whole lot more utility and you got a whole lot more utility than you would have gotten out of a Brandeis soda. But realize something else you might be purchasing. You might be purchasing the ability to keep him from doing something else to get money. If he's in a desperate situation, he's looking for the bank to support him, then he's probably not far away from looking for stealing to support him. We think that you disincentivize this when you tell him that he doesn't need to commit crimes to get money, that there are people in the world who have basic human kindness, and that he is taken care of within our society. I'm going to talk more about that in my second point, which I'm going to start right now. We're going to tell you why philanthropy should be a personal obligation. We're not telling you that it has to be a personal obligation. Jessica and I don't claim to be the arbiters of morality. We do think that it is a better framework if it is your personal obligation. We tell you to look to religion, to philosophy, to humanitarianism, progressivism. All of these various matrices through looking at things have tenets which tell you that it's good to help other people, that you shouldn't let people fall through the cracks. Realize that this individual has fallen through the cracks. The state has failed in its obligation to help him through whatever way it's supposed to be that keeps people from living out on the street. We think that an individual can pick up the slack, can help where the state left off.
Sure, as long as there are state mechanisms, like shelters, designed to help homeless people. Do you really think that it's the state's fault that it's fallen through the cracks, or more likely that it's actually something this person is doing that has caused them to fall through the cracks?
I want to address that in 2 different ways. The idea of shelters is my third point. It's called Shelters Aren't for Everyone, so we're going to get there in a minute. But the idea that it's his fault that he's done something to slip through the cracks, I just don't want you to sit there and judge. I don't want you to say, you know, whatever happened to him, I bet he deserved it. Because you know what? He could have lost his job in some kind of cutbacks. He might not speak English and had to may not be able to get, there are just a million and one ways in which it might be his fault and another million and one ways in which it might not be his fault. We'd rather gamble on the side of, hey, it doesn't really hurt anything and it does help him. We don't think that we're not going to sit in judgment of how he got there. That's not the kind of people we are. So what we're trying to tell you is that the state fulfilled the obligation. I talked to you about that, but now I want to talk to you about philanthropy as a human connection, because Jessica and I think that charity on a one-to-one level is really, really valuable. When you hand him this less than $1 worth of change, you show him that someone cared about him, that there was another person walking by on that busy street who cares about the human condition enough to lean over and help him out. Realize the difference that that makes for him. It really lifts his spirits because he shows them that someone cares, and we feel like that's a really much higher moral good. We also think that charity is good in other ways too, and they mentioned shelters, they mentioned donating to Africa. We think that you can have something like a charity budget, where most of your budget goes to things like shelters, but a small portion of your budget, say, the dollar and change that you might keep around every once in a while, just purchases this human connection. Purchases the ability to say, I care about you as an individual, and I know your life is tough on the streets, but keep in mind that the world doesn't hate you. Keep in mind that the world doesn't see you just as a scummy, filth-ridden whatever. There are some people who see you as a person. I'm one of those people. You should see yourself as a person. That just might make them, that individual, want to view themselves as a person in the real world, want to go out and actualize and do more good things because they realize that humanity supports them, even in small ways.
Sure. I'm not sure that throwing some change at somebody sends that message. Maybe if you want to send that message, send that message. Say, I give money to homeless shelters, go there, they can take care of you better than you can take care of yourself on the street.
That gives me a really good segue into my first point. I'm now going to tell you why shelters aren't for everyone, and this is really important. Obviously, he's chosen not to be in a shelter. What are some of the reasons for that? Have y'all been to a homeless shelter? They are loud, they are crowded, they are chaotic. It is not an atmosphere where you can feel like this is your home, or even like this is any place where you can sit and think safely for a minute. Realize that a very large percentage, I don't believe in percentages in debate rounds, but what I'm going to tell you is that after they close the mental hospitals, the percentage of people who are homeless and who are mentally insane skyrocketed. People who are mentally ill, people who have had drug addiction problems, can't stay in shelters. They get kicked out because they can't tolerate the atmosphere. If you're crazy, that's really hard to deal with. Maybe you want a quiet space and a street corner for you is better than a shelter. We don't think that shelters are the only way to help people. We don't think that shelters are for everyone. This guy didn't go to a shelter. There's obviously some reason that he didn't. We want to say we're not going to judge him for that any more than we're going to judge him for how he got on the corner. What we are going to say is that we can help him, even if it's in a small way. It doesn't hurt us, and we do think it has greater ramifications. For these reasons, we prepared.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for good remarks and call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a tremendous honor to be here. On side opposition today, we're not going to argue, certainly, that charity is bad. And it's a better solution for what you're going to do with this money, to go out and spend this money on buying yourself a snack or buying yourself something else. We think instead that charity is good, but the way you target your charity is the most important part of the way you carry out your charity. And that we're going to argue that it's a whole lot better to give this money to a shelter, or even better yet, give this money to Oxfam to directly help some starving child in Africa, rather than the or any charitable amount of money that we can come up with. I have 4 independent things. The first thing I want to talk about is government-designed mechanisms for basic care. So what we're going to tell you is that there are mechanisms within our society already in place that ensure that the basic necessities of life can be given to everyone. Things like shelter and things like food. At the point where those kinds of basic mechanisms exist, do you think it's quite likely that a person who's refusing those mechanisms might be doing so out of the reason to want to spend this money on something else, and as a result, they're not going to get those kinds of things? We think those government-designed mechanisms are the best mechanisms, and it's better to support those mechanisms, encourage greater use of those mechanisms, rather than just trying to go around this system and make people not aware of the problem of homelessness at large. The second thing we want to talk about is the need to seek help, which we think in broader terms, someone who is homeless on the street isn't going to be able to survive in that kind of a life forever. We think they are going to need to seek help, regardless of what kind of condition they're in. And the longer that they're able to just subsist in this kind of living, the longer that there actually are people giving them that kind of day-to-day charity, the longer they're going to remain in that kind of life and not seek the kind of actually do what's best for this person in the long term. And we think think just teaching them this kind of life is something they can live isn't that. The third thing I want to talk about is the probable use of this money, which I think in many cases it could be beneficial to give money to a homeless person. But I specifically tell you in case concert that you can't have a dialogue with this person first. You can't ask them, well, what are you going to do with this money? What is your past? Like, why did you become homeless in the first place? At that point, I think we just have to look at the probabilities. And as Amanda herself tells you, a lot of the people who decide not to go into shelters are people with psychological problems or people with drug addictions. We think, for the most part, those people are the least likely people to actually spend this money on what we want them to spend. Drugs, or the most likely just to not really know how to spend that money at all, to not use it in the way that's best for them. If you're going to do anything, buy the person a sandwich, but just giving them the money outright is the
Just briefly, we said buying sandwiches out, just so we don't muddle around a little bit. But what I wanted to ask you is, how can you know that you know what the best thing to do with that money is? How are you going to presume that whatever choice you make with the money, you know?
I can presume that the best use of the money isn't buying crack cocaine. The fourth thing I want to talk about is the arbitrariness of this scheme. Which we think essentially giving money to one person who you happen to see on the street is advantaging that one person, and the choice of that one person who you want to advantage is inherently arbitrary. There are plenty of homeless people in this country, plenty of people who don't have basic necessities in this country. If you want to donate, you think it's a whole lot better not to just donate to one arbitrarily chosen person, but rather to attempt to use your charity in a way that's going to help everyone equally, or have a better chance of helping everyone equally. Specifically, we think if you don't do that, if you generally set the precedent that just giving to individual homeless people is the way to go in terms of charitable contributions, you're just going to reward aggressiveness among these people, rather than rewarding the people who Let's look at the case they presented. The first thing they talk about is the idea that this money is going to mean more to a homeless. They say, the money means nothing to you. Well, it certainly does mean something to you at the point where there are other uses of this money. They say buying a sandwich is out, like giving to charity is out. We might say that these are alternative uses of the money, even if you can't do that in this particular situation. I think there are lots of other options, better charitable uses of the money, that even if they might not mean something directly to you in terms of your ability to get food, they certainly do mean something to the world at large and make a better contribution to society. They talk about the immediate use that this homeless person has. You don't know what that use is, and I think that's extremely important. As long as many of the people who are not in shelters are people who are recovering from drug problems, or may not even be recovering from drug problems, may still have those drug problems, people who may be mentally imbalanced, we don't think just kind of fueling the idea that you can exist on the street and not get help is the best method to say. We also think that you ought to act out of a concern for society, not just out of a concern for this individual person. If you're actually trying to do good, it's a charitable endeavor. We don't think it's okay to just do good for an individual at the expense of society at large. You want to create a societal condition in which the actions that are best not for one particular homeless person, but for homeless people at large and society at large are taken. I think it's a whole lot better to send the message that charity is good, creating governmental institutions to solve the problem of homelessness is good. This kind of individual philanthropy isn't the best way to go. If you're going to say you can pay for the good feeling inside you, first of all, I would tell you that if the consequences of getting that feeling are bad effects for the individual homeless person, encouraging them to maintain the life they have, to not seek help, and you might get that feeling, but that feeling isn't genuine, and that feeling isn't actually a good feeling. You can get in plenty of other ways by giving that money to charity. The next thing they talk about is dividing your charitable budget and using some money in some ways and some money in other ways. This money still matters equally much in all of these contexts. And we think it's better to take that individual dollar as part of the charity budget and direct it to things like Cox Tim, to things like shelters. And they say these people are going to take other actions to get the money, like stealing. I don't think this is an independent reason to take this action. I think the fact that someone might do something illegal if you don't help them is just a reason why people acting outside the law is a way for them to get help. Seeing people as willing to take that kind of drastic action is a reason why people will help. We don't think that should be a reason. We don't think it's a bad idea. The second thing they talk about is philanthropy as a personal obligation. We accept this obligation, but we don't think that obligation extends to this personal life. We think you're going to be a whole lot more effective as a philanthropist. You're going to give out money equally. You're going to give out money in a way that you know it's going to be used constructively. They say there are plenty of things that could have happened to him. He could be a Vietnam vet who just went through a series of terrible circumstances and lost each other. He could be, but it seems more likely that people like that are going to be in shelters. The very analysis Amanda gives you about the type of people who can't stay in shelters. It seems like the people who can't stay in shelters are the people who are the least likely to use this money well if they have this money. What we tell you is sacrificing control of your charity isn't a worthwhile cause just to get this human dimension. But we also think you can get that human dimension in other ways. Specifically, by going and working within a homeless shelter. By going and saying, this is specifically what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to demonstrate my caring to you. And that caring is going to specifically be doing something that accomplishes something you need to survive. Not just necessarily providing something that money that could be used for drugs, but providing a clear, concrete benefit, the benefit of things like shelter. You can also work to make homeless shelters better. They might be loud, they might be crowded, but you, by donating your time and donating your money, can do things to change those kinds of negative conditions. The last thing they talk about then is that shelters aren't perfect. When they say they're loud and they're crowded, I've just talked about this. I think the more effort you put into it, the better you can make shelters, and we think that's the direction that your charitable contributions ought to be. But then they also tell you about the kind of people who aren't going to be able to stay in shelters. They say it's the insane and the drug addicted who can't necessarily take this atmosphere, maybe some others. We think those groups of people are the people who are least likely to be able to decide how to spend this money, and as a result, we think that these are the kind of people who you ought not give this money to most of all. I don't think that mentally ill people are just automatically kicked out of shelters. I think shelters ought to, and in most cases do, make an effort to accommodate these people. We don't think just giving money to the people who can't spend it is better than giving the money to an institution and a social structure that can actually concretely solve its problems, not just for one person, but for everyone.
Leader of Opposition for closing remarks. Call upon member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, members of this most august panel, members of this most august House, everybody for being here, Brandeis especially for a really fantastic Nats. Thanks to Amanda, my wonderful, eloquent, beautiful partner. I've been done it for 3 years without her, and since we have been going since the beginning of yesterday, thanks especially for all those speeches, and thanks to our friends outside out for, I hope, a case that we're all going to enjoy. That being said, I want to go ahead and address what's already on the flow, starting out with the observation that was given us by the Leader of the Opposition. He says that you can give this money to charities, but there are lots of other places that are going to have better uses for it. Recognize, Mr. Speaker, members of this panel, that you can give money to charities on either side of the House. Amanda and I have no problem with that. We're not talking about that whatsoever. What we're saying is that you can have kind of a charity budget. You can have high-risk investments and low-risk investments. Low-risk investments include things like all of the charities that the opposition has talked to you about. A high-risk investment would be giving the change in your pocket to a homeless individual when you're not sure how they're going to spend it. We believe that the appropriate charity budget portfolio would include some high and some low-risk investments. Even though charitable contributions are overall going to be a good thing. The first independent point given by the Leader of the Opposition is that there are state mechanisms that are currently in place, not right now, and that therefore these are the best kinds of ways these people can get help, that all homeless people can get help. Absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. First of all, there is no mandate that says that if you're homeless, you have to go to a shelter. You have the right to stay out there on the street corners. People at the ACLU have been defending this right for a really long time. It is a lifestyle decision. It's not one that 99.99% of us would ever actually want to make. But if you're not the kind of people who are homeless on the streets, and they have every right to make that kind of a decision, again, we can't judge them. We don't know the kind of situation that they're in. On that point, one of you.
Okay, so your partner told us that a tremendously large percentage of these people are mentally unstable. Do you really think we should defend the right of mentally unstable people to make their own life decisions, as opposed to forcing them to seek help from professionals?
I believe that there's no actual alternative in the status quo where we can force them to be in a homeless shelter or anywhere else. What I believe is when they have the right to be on the street corner, that we have the ability in this situation that Amanda and I have given you to decide how we're going to interact with them. Whether we're going to treat them as a mentally ill person who has no concept of rationality, and no decision making, and no future, nothing possible, or as a human being, as someone that we're going to someone who's worth investing in because they are another person. Okay. The second point brought up by the Leader of the Opposition is that you're going to facilitate this person to continue to be homeless in the future. Amanda and I don't believe that the 85 cents that you do or do not give this individual is going to whether or not they decide that they want to be on the streets forever. In addition, though, we would say that in the situation in which we describe describe this individual, they are already incentivized to no longer be homeless. There are enough drawbacks of just homelessness that people by and large don't want to stay. On that point.
Either this money matters or it doesn't. Either it's actually substantively going to help this person, in which case it might cause them to change lifestyle decisions in the future.
We believe that the way that this money can change things is when you actually have a human interaction with it. Is when you commit to them, and you give them something and you show them that it's not just vast, faceless structures that are shelters that care about them, but individual human beings. When you respond to what they've done appropriately, when you reinforce the kinds of behavior, the decisions that they've made that are good, these are things that we advocate on our side of the house. The third one I think is the most important one already on the opposition club. They say that this person is going to use the money in bad ways, and I want to talk about this a lot, Mr. Speaker. The first thing Amanda and I want to tell you on our side of the house is that this money isn't going to be the reason that the person makes a decision to use money in a good or a bad way. They're going to have some kind of money that they're taking in if they're going to be panhandling on the street, and whether they use that for a good thing or for a bad thing isn't going to be decided by what you do now. But for every person who walks by them and refuses to give them money and shows them that nobody cares, we believe that they have a massive societal incentive to go on making these kinds of bad decisions. The things that we would traditionally think are not good, things like drug use, things like that. But I want to go ahead and defend all that on our side of the house as well, because I don't think there's anything necessarily immoral with the kind of individual that Amanda and I have talked to you about choosing to spend this money on something like alcohol or drugs. What Amanda and I are going to tell you is that there are always going to be people who are going to slip through the cracks of any kind of system that we set up, and that these individuals minimally have the right to try and escape the kind of terrible reality of poverty and starvation, or one of its realities like insanity. They have a right to try to escape that, and we don't think you have any right to judge whether or not it's a good or a bad decision for this person to spend their money on drugs, on things like that. The fourth point that the opposition brings up is that this is arbitrary. We're just going to be helping this one guy. Okay, again, think about the concept of a charity budget. You can help lots of people, you can do lots of things, you can volunteer on our side of the house. None of that is at issue here. The question is how much you can do with this money. For every person who walks by and doesn't give this man money, for every person who refuses to make eye contact and doesn't even consider them as another individual human being, there is a harm done. We believe on our side of the house that a much bigger benefit is accrued when you do something, when you interact, when you offer this, when you recognize someone's need and do what you can to actually ameliorate that as a human being, not right now. Okay. Then the last thing the opposition says before going to case side is that you're going to encourage this person to beg aggressively if you go with our side of the house. Amanda and I absolutely disagree with that. Right now, we only know that this person has made a few choices. We know that they've decided not to beg aggressively. We know that they have a little sign up saying, "Homeless, please donate." And that's it. We believe that you should reward and reinforce the kinds of positive, non-intrusive, non-violent ways that this person has chosen to ask for money. We believe that you should do that by giving the money, not at this time. That being said, I want to go to that case side. The first point that Amanda talked about was the relative effectiveness, the utility of the money to you versus to this individual. The leader of the opposition says that society overall still has better uses for it. There are still charities, there are still other kinds of programs. Fine, but we're not going to donate the money to society overall. There isn't a charity that we can give it to right now. What Amanda tells you is that if you don't give this money to this individual, you are likely to spend it on a soda, because that's the kind of thing that you're going to need. And you're not going to go and take it and put it at home and write a check for 85 cents to the Salvation Army or to some other kind of social shelter. We don't think that's the kind of situation that we have whatsoever in this town. Again, the leader of the opposition says it's only going to be good for the individual. We believe that there's a societal benefit when individuals are good to one another, when there are acts of compassion and altruism, and when people are help. That is a great benefit for the individual and a societal one overall too.
Presumably this isn't only going to happen once. You're going to see homeless people every day. One homeless person
Okay,
once.
the way that I would answer this is when I'm walking on my way to work, and if I see a homeless guy and I give him the change and I don't have any change when we get to the next guy, Amanda and I aren't advocating running down to the nearest ATM and withdrawing more money to go and give more for what you see. What we're saying is that in a situation in which you find yourself with someone when you have what is essentially extra money in your pocket, you should give it to the person who really, really needs it. Amanda talked to you about the fact that you're going to be disincentivizing negative routes, things like stealing. We still think this is important. give you the conception of the state as the institution of all of our best selves. And I would say that sometimes, no matter how hard we try, the state is going to fail some people. But that does not in any way decrease the obligation that each of us as individuals has to be our best self when we interact with other people. In this situation, you have the ability to make up for something that is currently lacking. You can help someone who is in need. Amanda and I absolutely think on our side of the house that you ought to do that. He briefly addresses the concept of the charity budget. I think I've hit that a couple times. I think it's kind of misunderstood me out. I'm sure we'll get to it more in their next speech. The last thing Amanda does talk about, however, is shelters overall. She said that there are reasons why these are not places for everyone. And all the opposition says is, if there are problems with shelters, then try to fix those. Go and volunteer in them. Actually do something proactive. You can do all of that on our side of the house too. What we're talking about is a very specific, very isolated situation in which you can only use the change in your pocket to make but so much of a difference. Amanda and I believe that the difference that you ought to make here should be positive, should be compassionate, should be recognizing the humanity in every individual, even those who seem least like ourselves. That's what we're advocating on our side of the house. For all of these reasons, we're very proud of the work.
Some finite charity budget, which sort of they talk about, right? Essentially, every time you have change in your pocket, you can either give that to a homeless person, or put it in a jar and give that to some cause at the end of the year. Now, I think one thing that should be made perfectly clear, both for the purposes of this round and in fact for how all of you live your life, is that there's a lot of incredibly good causes for the world that can be accomplished with incredibly little money. Right now, today, in sub-Saharan Africa, the southern end of Africa, there are people starving to death simply because there's been a famine there and there isn't enough food. To buy somebody a bowl of rice, which they need to live for one more day, costs about 5 cents. Which means if you put that dollar into famine relief in Africa, you can keep somebody alive for almost a month on what it would cost this homeless person to buy a cup of coffee. So I think if you're thinking about what's the most effective way to spend this money, how can I do the most good with this money? Think about famine relief. Think about preventing water supply to the villages of the third world. These are things that can be done far more effectively, will do far more good with your money than this homeless person possibly could. Sure.
I hate to sound like a broken record, but why can't you do that and drop this money in the cup? I don't understand why these things are mutually exclusive.
Okay, again, the budget is fine. I agree with this dollar that you're their first point is look, there's this relative effectiveness of the money, right? You have to spend it in the place where it's most effective. But their second point is well, you should do philanthropy in such a way that it makes you feel good. I think there's a very fundamental tension here, at the point where they're not the side that gets you the most effective use of the money. What we're going to say is if their first point is true, if the primary thing you should be looking at is the relative effectiveness of the money, then you shouldn't be doing what makes you feel good. You should be doing what's going to help the most people. You should be doing what's going to make you feel good, regardless of how that makes you feel right now. So the third thing I want to talk about is this point about high-risk investments. Because the only reason it's good to have high-risk investments in your portfolio is because, on average, they have a higher yield. Starving man, a bowl of rice is very, very high. You know that 5 cents will save his life. You know that 5 cents will save his life. That isn't high yield in the homeless. So the second thing that they talk about, thank you, is this idea that philanthropy should be an obligation. Now, the points are together, blur together here a little bit, I think it's fine. One thing I want to point out is, look, it's probably not that the marginal effect of this $1 will do that much. The marginal effect of this $1 will change the way the homeless person lives their life. But at the point where you're supporting an unhealthy lifestyle, at the point where you're giving somebody a very, very serious problem, the means to perpetuate that problem, you're complicit in the harm. So you have to I'm going to stay on the street and smoke crack, as opposed to going to the shelter. We're not going to be allowed to smoke crack because I'm desperate to go to the shelter. I think you're complicit in his decision to stay on the street at the point where you're helping him to do it. So first of all, they talk about a connection. I just don't think this connection is that genuine. Handing somebody a fistful of nickels doesn't make a deep human connection. The shelter can be spent on a social worker trained to make these human connections feel part of the job than you will by putting some money in a cup. we talk about the better message the census is heading. You send a message either way, but I think the message that like, I'm going to give, but I'm going to give responsibly is a very good message, a very good example, and a totally reasonable thing to say to this homeless person. No thing. But the final thing they say is like, look, paying for this feeling is like good. What we're going to say is if like getting this feeling isn't what does the most good in the world, getting this feeling is selfish. It's essentially the same as like spending the money on just something for yourself. We should like trust these feelings that are just based on a mistake. Like you feel good because you're helping this guy, but actually he spends his money, like the money you gave him, like buying some more crack. You're not actually helping him. The mere fact that you've deluded yourself into thinking you're helping him isn't a very good reason to feel good. So the final thing they talk about is shelters aren't for everyone. We'd say like shelters are bad, but they're better than 42nd Street. And moreover, if you think the poor quality of homeless shelters is a problem, a good thing to do with your money would be to give it to homeless shelters, right? Moreover, like they do help like the people that need the help most. Like they don't turn you away from a homeless shelter because like you have mental problems. That's just not true. If they do it because they're sending you to like a serious institution to seriously treat you. Ultimately, the final thing they say under here, the thing I want to hit really hard, is this notion that we have no right to judge. They say, this person's maybe smoking crack or something like that. Who are we to say that it's bad? I'm something of a moral relativist in some cases, but I think these things can be taken too far. I'm willing to stand up here and say definitively that yes, smoking crack is bad. Over your life to such an extent that you're sleeping on the goddamn street. Drug addiction is a form of slavery. No rational decision can free you from drug addiction. Because crack is over your body. Sorry, crack, for all the bad mouthing of crack. People aren't capable of making a decision for themselves. They're not capable of simply coming to the rational realization that they don't want to smoke crack anymore. They're only going to get help at the point where they're forced to get help. And when they can't survive on the street, when they can't get money from begging, that's what's going to turn them to the homeless shelters. When they go to the homeless shelters, which can prevent them from getting drugs, prevent them from taking those drugs, and get them the psychological help that they need, that's when they're going to get better. That's when they're going to turn their life around. I simply don't think the life of a crackhead on the street can be compared to the life of a productive individual. I'm willing to take that stand. So with that said, let's turn to Jay's. With that said, let's turn to Jay's point. I'm going to sort of combine the first two, which are about homeless shelters. These government-designed mediums that provide you with help. Once again, as these guys tell you, a huge percentage of homeless people are mentally ill. A huge percentage of the homeless people that aren't mentally ill have some sort of substance abuse problem. And obviously also there's a good deal of overlap. Like mentally ill people with substance abuse problems. I think a good analogy here is with like paternalistic laws. In general, I'm not a huge fan of paternalistic laws. Like I'm the most libertarian person in the United States, like Emily Schleicher. I think even she would say that, like, in the case of like really insane people, paternalistic laws are like somewhat justified. The whole notion that you have no right to judge some other person's actions is based on that person being able to rationally evaluate their actions. People with serious mental problems can't do this. Drug addicts can't do this. I think a good analogy is like handing a drink to an alcoholic. An alcoholic is somebody with a serious problem. And while you can, hand him that whiskey sour and say, well, he's the one making the decision to take it. A very, very irresponsible thing. That means of harming himself. So the third thing Jay talks about is like the probable use of this, right? Because like maybe this homeless guy will spend this money on food, maybe he'll blow a nice crack. You know that if you give the money to like Oxfam or like UNICEF or somebody like that, they're not gonna like accidentally say, you should have cracked it. More likely than not that this situation will do more harm than good. So if you believe anything they say about an obligation to do charity, feeling like you're doing charity isn't doing charity. Actually helping people is doing charity. So the fourth and final thing Jay talks about is this notion that it's arbitrary, right? Like ultimately it's better to spread this money out evenly than to give it to one guy who you happen to see. There's lots of people in the world that need help. The mere fact that somebody lives near me is not the best reason to help them. Who's the people you should help most are the people that need the help most. And while homeless people need help more than most of us do, there's a lot of starving people in the third world who need that help a whole hell of a lot more than homeless people do. There's a lot of starving people in the third world who don't have the option of going to a shelter where it's a little bit uncomfortable, but they can get food. There simply is no food. But moreover, what we tell you is when you give this money to a person, when you hand them some change, you don't make a real connection. When you give it to a shelter, you support like a shelter employee who can make a real connection. They're a social worker trained to make these connections with very mentally unstable people when we think they do the most good. Ultimately, look, giving money to a homeless person feels good. I'm going to admit, I feel good when I give money to a homeless person. But there's a place for compassion. But there's also a place for reason. What we're going to say is that compassion should tell us that the right thing to to do is to help other people, even if it doesn't mean getting the most good for us. But I also think if we really believe in this goal, if we really believe it's worthwhile to help people, we should use our brain as well as our hearts and do what's going to help the most people. Do what's going to help people that need it the most. Make sure we're not doing any harm in the name of making ourselves feel good. We oppose.
Side speech. Go for it. 2 minutes.
Thanks, everyone. You know, one of the things I kind of heard a lot about in the member opposition piece, I felt I had to come up here and talk about, was this whole idea that somehow Oxfam and all these things really know the best way to go out there and the best way to, control your aid, make sure it goes to the best people. But I think I want to point something out here. I want to point out that when you give this money to Oxfam, they complain constantly about how you don't know what this homeless guy's going to spend money on. You really don't know what's going to go to Oxfam. This great wonderful organization. But let's look at the people who actually work at Oxfam. They work in local cultures in sub-Saharan Africa. These local cultures have histories of corruption. They do. So this dollars you are going to pay to this regime, only 50 cents of it might go towards aid. The other 50 cents of it might go towards these corrupt regimes. I would also like to point out that there are a lot of reasons people don't like to give aid. Because it does also, in another way, make sure that the leaders of the nation don't have to necessarily feed their people. These regimes will go out and do it for them. Those countries he talks about, the reason they're not getting any aid is because they're forcing people to give them extra money. They're not taking genetically modified food and stuff like that. That's one way in which they do these kind of things. And I don't really think that it's quite as beneficial as they talk about it. But in addition to something else, they talk about this is the most important dollar in the world. Has anyone else noticed this? It's a really important dollar. But this $1 doesn't eliminate this apparently finite jar that's magically been created. And what I want to point out is, if you give this $1 to this one guy, and it provides this one benefit, don't you get, first of all, more human personal benefit? And don't you also see an immediate benefit to him? Isn't $1 for him better than 1 penny for 100 different people? Doesn't that give him a better chance of actually doing something with it? And I think the human element's really been dropped here. Something I like to do when I'm going through the Baltimore Tunnel and driving, I like to get the guy at the toll booth, I have a nice day, and I try to really mean, I try to smile at him, and I want him to know that it's a hard 8 hours, 9 hours. And when he looks back at me, sometimes they do, and they smile and they really say thank you, they really appreciate that. And I think that makes that, that moment worth even more. It makes them a little better, it makes their job a little happier. And I think that's something they can't have with all these things they talk about. I think going up here and saying thank you to them really does mean something to them in the end. And it's really, really important. Finally, they say, if he runs out of money, he'll go to a shelter. So apparently no homeless people ever die on the streets. No homeless people ever decide to spend a night off in the cold, they're in a sleeping bag, rather than go to a shelter. No, let me tell you, in DC, hundreds of homeless people a year die because they would rather sit out in the cold and take that chance in sub-zero temperatures and go to a homeless shelter. It is a real problem. A lot of people won't go to it. And by giving this dollar to them, maybe you're giving them the chance to go out and get some food. Maybe you're giving them the chance to go out and buy a blanket. And even if he is a drug addict, we'd rather have a live drug addict than a dead drug addict. And so it's for that I probably think government.
Opposition speech? Mr. Nichols?
One thing I'd like to say is I really applaud the UVA team for talking about a moral decision that I think affects all of us. Are an interesting issue. This is something we deal with all the time. One piece of advice, though, every time a bum passes me, I just tell them I'm a Republican. For some reason, I stop asking. I'd suggest that to anyone who's bum. The first thing I want to talk about briefly is how much does $1 buy? I think it's fallacy to think of chipping in 75 cents is somehow going to vastly improve the quality of this homeless guy's life. It's not as though Rufus the stunt bum has an IRA that's going to shift 25 cents of that money to him, and then at some point down the line, his life is going to be vastly improved. It's not a coincidence that like a slice of pizza or a bottle of malt liquor are around $2, because that's precisely the kind of thing that this guy's going to spend the money on. So understand when they say, well, you know, utility is that much improvement on their sort of house, it's really kind of fickle, right? Like, there's some minor short-term pleasure that the bum is going to get the money out of, and that's where the money goes, right? So no one's life is ultimately improved. Contrast that with this side of the house, right? Where if every single one of us spent that dollar that we made chipping a bums, like a hat or whatever, or an empty coffee cup, where if every one of us gave that to some kind of family relief association, there would actually be some tangible benefit to people's lives because of economies of scale, because of all the reasons. Because like an organization can institutionally provide benefits that increase the quality of people's lives, rather than ensuring they get their bottle of Coke 45 with you. I think that's relevant. The second thing I want to talk about, though, is let's think about homeless people, right? I mean, I don't understand that homeless people are homeless because they're lazy. And while I'm an insane Republican, realize that most of the reasons people are homeless is because they're crazy, right? They're just fucking nuts. Understand that giving money to crazy people is not a very responsible thing. I mean, like, every street corner is filled with guys who are convinced they're Napoleon Bonaparte, right? And Napoleon Bonaparte, the son of a bunch of money, isn't a very good business because you know they're going to spend it on something irresponsible. That's important. I think you have a responsibility to make sure that your money is used in a responsible fashion. The final thing I want to close on is sort of an observation. Why do people actually give money to bums? Why do people give money to homeless individuals? I don't think they do it because they understand rationally that it's like the most moral thing to do. I think people give money to homeless people for stupid, selfish reasons all the time. Because they want the bum to stop passing them, right? Because they like want to feel some short-term pleasure for chipping money in someone's hat and feeling good for a minute. But understand that selfish pleasure is stupid and irrelevant in the greater context of things. If what you really value is helping people, improving the quality of individuals' lives, trying to make sure that someone does die on the streets, then don't give them those 75 cents that they'll spend on a bottle of malt liquor. Give those 75 cents to a homeless shelter, which will make sure they don't die later on. Thank you.
Yeah, crossbench.
What are you doing? You want to do a question? Yes. Why?
I just wanted to first say something, I guess, against the government team. Is they talk about throughout the round, well, you could also give to charity too, you know? It seems like there's some sort of like money tree, right? There's like an infinite amount of money in the world. And the opposition team just pointed out perfectly that there isn't, that if we're assuming that this is, you know, a reasonable person, a reasonable normal person, even a reasonable poor college student, they're not gonna have so much money to spend on everything, right? So they're only gonna be able to spend a small amount of money. And therefore, by giving the dollar to the bum, you have to assume for this round to make any sense that you have a dollar less to give to charity. But anyway, that's from the opposition side. Against the opposition side, I think they're a bunch of fucking altruistic bastards. I mean, their entire opposition point, the entire thing that their opposition thing stands on, is to give to public charities. And honestly, I wouldn't give to charity. And I think that's really, I mean, when I have a dollar on the street, I think there are a lot of ways that people can spend their dollar. How many people here actually give to charities on a regular basis? You know, does Aaron give to the toll booth guy an extra tip when he passes by? Just gives him a smile, right? I think there are a bunch of ways that we can spend 99 cents. For example, magnets or candy at a 99-cent shop. Gum if you have bad breath. Money for your child's milk at school. I think that child would get a lot more from that. A Subway run on a tea or another Subway system. Now, my favorite is 99 cents menu at Burger King. I mean, there's some great options here. And as a poor college student, I'm going to tell you, that Burger King, you know, at like 3 a.m. in the morning was much more beneficial to me and made me feel a lot better than giving to a poor guy in the street who was hassling me on my way to Burger King. And finally, riding like a toy pony in the mall. That was a nervous thing. I think riding a toy pony in the mall, the excitement that you get, are priceless. And those looks, I think, are more beneficial to me than giving money to a poor person on the street. So give to charity all you want, but keep that dollar. Thanks.
I close the board. Speeches, and I'll call upon the Speaker of Opposition to the first.
Round to mean anything, and I think it does. Money has to matter, and this money actually has to have some tangible. This money doesn't just disappear. If you're actually thinking about this choice as a moral choice, taking the time to think about it and reason about it, then that money isn't going to just go to a soda. That money is going to go in a jar that at the end of the year is going to go to charity. If you're thinking rationally about how to use that money, making that calculation, you really can not just waste that money. You can say 85 cents isn't that much. I think 85 cents then isn't that much on either side of the house. It's not going to substantively improve the life of an individual person. And added up, it actually can do something if every person puts in 85 cents a day to this kind of charitable cause. You're going to have change in your pocket every day. So 85 cents a day over the course of a year becomes something like $300. And those kinds of amounts of money become significant, become a large portion of that charity budget they talk about. Within that idea of a charity budget, they say, essentially, this is a high-risk investment we should be on. It may be a high-risk investment, but in this case, we think it's a junk bond, and it's a junk bond without a higher return than any other investment. There's a great chance that you're just going to lose this investment entirely if it's spent on alcohol, if it's spent on drugs. But there isn't a chance that you're going to get that higher return. $1 given to a charitable organization is still going to buy $1 of food, the same $1 of food that it's going to buy if you give it to this person on the street. As a result, the return is the same, you just eliminate that risk and you can do better good. Second major thing I want to talk about deals with this sort of individual element. Because I think the main argument side government has left to stand on is that there's some benefit to this personal interaction. Throwing change at someone doesn't say, I care, especially when there isn't the personal interaction that side government can't provide. They say, you're not having a conversation with this person about what their life was like, about how they got to be homeless in the first place. You're not having that kind of meaningful interaction. You're just giving them money without taking the time to do that. We think it's extremely important that doesn't send that kind of evidence. What does? Volunteering in a homeless shelter. Using part of your charity budget to actually fund these kind of shelters so you can pay social workers who not only care, but are trained to care, know how to deal with these people, know how to make their lives substantively better. You may get a good feeling as a result of giving this money to a person whose face you can see. We tell you that that good feeling is just based on a mistake and based on selfishness. They tell you that true altruism is a goal that every person should have. Then true altruism shouldn't just be based on your own personal satisfaction from giving. It should be based on the real impact of that giving. The last thing I want to talk about then is complicity in social harms. So we think at the point where you're giving this money to individuals who could spend that money in bad ways, then you yourself are helping to contribute to the very problems that create homelessness. If paternalism is ever justified, paternalism is justified towards the mentally ill, or to the drug or alcohol addicted, who are not rational because they're being driven by their addiction. Rational people can't make decisions for themselves, but how they want to spend money. We're not necessarily saying that use on drugs or use on alcohol is always wrong in every case. But I think we can say that it's not the best use of this money that you're trying to spend. That it's objectively better if you can ensure that this money is spent on food, that there's a possibility that that money is going to be spent on practical. What we tell you, moreover, is that the decision to remain addicted to drugs, to continue to go down these wrong life paths, is actually going to hurt these people's ability to get themselves on their feet in the future. Someone who's on the street now is never going to get off the street as long as they remain addicted to cocaine. The point where you're giving them money to spend on things like that. Money that the majority of people who are on the street who are things like mentally ill, who are things like addicted to drugs. Just the ability to maintain that kind of lifestyle with we also think we send a message of inequality. If you're going to make a charitable contribution, we think it's a whole lot worse when some people get all the benefits of that contribution than if you can actually distribute those benefits across society. Or even better, distribute those benefits to the people who can get the greatest amount of good off. We tell you that for this same 85 cents a day, you can feed a number of starving children in Africa and actually keep them alive. Homeless people, while shelters may not be perfect, have the option of going to that shelter, have mechanisms that are in place to try to allow them to survive. At this point, you're not doing the most possible. The last thing I want to talk about is the acceptance of this social situation. As long as a person can survive, they will, and society won't do more to address the problem of homelessness. As long as you put band-aid individual solutions on the problem, then society isn't going to tackle the larger issue of making sure that everyone does have this kind of change, and that the government, at a societal level, solves the problems that it needs to solve.
wherein they can be the human connection. But that's the entire point that Jessica and I are talking about. It's the same reason shelters aren't a good human connection either. Because shelters are obligated to do it. Because social workers are out. It's their job. Even if they chose to go into that job, the homeless person doesn't see them as humanity caring about them. They see them as someone who works within the system, someone who shows up to work every day. You, as an individual, can be spontaneous, can be wonderful. They call it arbitrary on their side of the house. We embrace that arbitrariness. It's great that you arbitrarily want to help someone, and that's exactly the message that we want to send to you. In the system of helping homeless people in order to want to help homeless people. That you believe that they're people, even when it's not your job to do so. I think that's really important. Recognize that this individual is right in front of you. They haven't addressed the fact that whether you walk away or stay does have an impact on him. That this isn't just a theory, it's a guy sitting in front of you on the street. Because recognize that it's not either have a human connection or don't have something neutral. It's have a human connection or incur all the harms of not connecting, of averting your eyes and walking away. They tell you about inside the house about people turning to drugs and alcohol. Jessica and I tell you that it's only when they believe that no one in the world cares about them that they want to turn to things like drugs and alcohol. That if you want to encourage this guy to go buy more drugs, go ahead, avert your eyes, let him know that you don't think he's a human, that you don't care. That's doing an act of harm to him. Lastly, under the idea of human connection, I want to talk about encouraging good begging, because it's something else that they never address on their side of the house. Realize that you're letting this guy know, hey, you don't have many choices, and I understand that, but you did choose not to get in my face. You did choose not to head me off at the end or try and squeegee my windshield. Instead, you chose to just make a plea, and I'm answering your plea. I'm acknowledging that good choice. I'm acknowledging your plea. I think he feels acknowledged. And my God, that feeling of acknowledgement can make such a huge difference in whether you believe that as an individual you ought to go on trying each day or not. So having said that, now I want to make my third crystallization point, which is we like crack. Or also known as what will he do with the money? Because we don't mind him doing crack with money. We'll get there in a minute. One thing I think he will do with the money is still want to not be homeless. They give you a lot of argumentation about how he uses money. He's going to say, hey, I love the streets and I love panhandling. We don't buy this. We think that people don't love the streets or love panhandling. We think that technology has some difference. We don't think that it's going to have that kind of difference. But what else will he do with the money? Well, they claim that he's going to, in this they throw in a lot of paternalistic analysis. They say you can regulate what he does with the money because you can pass paternalistic laws as an individual and not as a government. I don't understand that. I think the paternalistic laws are what governments do, and what you want to treat this individual like has nothing to do with paternalistic laws. What we think you shouldn't do is judge this guy's actions. If he thinks that crack is going to warm his life, then that's okay. They said on the side of the house, if he does drugs, he must be incompetent to decide everything. We certainly disagree. We have to think that drugs are a valid choice. We even get a quote over here that life as a crackhead can't be compared to that of a productive individual. We see that individual as a life, as a human, whether he's a crackhead or whether he's an executive. We think that both ways to be are still ways to be human. And we're not going to tell him that his life is terrible. I think that they can't get up here and say that crack isn't a valid option when they haven't lived on the streets. No, really. Crack isn't a valid option for me, but I ain't homeless. If I were homeless, if I did have the dark, destitute life where I never ate and slept on the ground, I might say crack sounds so much better than homeless. Not be aware of his surroundings if that's really the thing that he decides that he most needs to do. But we want to give him the decision to decide what he most needs